We sometimes wonder what Putin's dreams must look like, and we think we have a pretty good idea. What Putin wants, more than anything else in the world, is to be recognized as the man who made Russia great again. He wants statues. He wants people to speak to him in the same way as they spoke to the Tsars and Soviet leaders who oversaw Russia at its heights. Putin dreams of making Russia big, and he wanted Ukraine to be his key to doing it. But he failed. And all he has really done is make Russia smaller than it was before he invaded. Russia now faces something worse than defeat against Ukraine, a slide into irrelevance triggered by Putin's relentless ambition. Putin's entire vision of the world is built upon his own ego. For Putin, how people treat him is directly tied to how they treat Russia as a whole, as he attempts to position himself as the representation of everything that Russia is supposed to be. Understanding this simple fact explains so much of what Russia's president is trying to do in Ukraine. One of the goals, and perhaps the main goal of all, of the so-called special military operation was to put honor and glory on Putin's name in the eyes of the rest of the world. He believed that by conquering Ukraine, he could go down in history as one of the great Russian leaders, and by extension, Russia would become bigger and more glorious due to his achievements. It's egotistical, and it's ultimately driven by the fact that Putin has long felt that the West doesn't respect him or Russia anywhere near as much as it should. It's no coincidence that Putin highlighted NATO's expansion as one of his major issues when he invaded Ukraine. He'd been doing that for well over a decade before, not necessarily because he feared NATO. Putin has never believed that NATO would start a war with Russia. What he feared was that NATO's expansion would be tied to his own tenure as Russia's president. The West would have grown larger, and in Putin's mind, Russia's sphere of influence would have become smaller if he didn't do anything. For Putin, that situation could not be allowed to happen. He wants to be great. He wants to be revered. Putin wants to be the man that Russians point to in 100 years as the man who returned his country to the heights of the Russian empires of old or the Soviet Union. The war against Ukraine was supposed to be the first step along this path to legacy. But what it ended up being was the noose that Putin wrapped around his own neck, as his desperate hunt for glory has done nothing more than cripple Russia, empower Ukraine, and create a future that will ensure that Putin ends up in their history books, only not for the reasons that he'd always hoped for. Let's look at what the war has done to Russia geopolitically, starting with the country that was and still is Putin's target, Ukraine. For Putin, the defeat of Ukraine would lead to Russia being considered the great power out of the big three of the US, China, and Russia. It would be the beginning of the resurgence. First would come the subjugation of Ukraine, securing its $15 trillion in mineral wealth, a massive territory bordering NATO, and the raw prestige of a conqueror, followed by remaining small territories in Europe once held by the Soviet orbit. That was the grand plan, but all Putin managed to do was light the fuse that resulted in Ukraine exploding into a global power unlike anything that Putin could envision. Look at Ukraine today and you see exactly what we mean. Russia has been exposed as a middle power that isn't on the same level as the US and China, and that exposure has come at the cost of Ukraine developing into a stronger nation than it ever would have been if Putin's army had just stayed out. Even now, after well over 4 years of fighting, the front line in Ukraine is relatively static, and Russia still has around 80% of the country to go if it's going to achieve Putin's vision. Through its drone diplomacy, Ukraine has become a military force to be reckoned with on the global stage, as well as in its own territory. Deals are being struck all over Europe as Ukraine ingratiates itself deeply into the NATO structure that Putin wanted to weaken, despite not being a member of NATO itself. In the Middle East, Ukraine is striking deals with the likes of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates, each of which lasts a decade, includes promises of money and oil, and has only been made possible because of the drones that Ukraine was forced to develop to fend off Putin's invasion. What was supposed to be an inevitable victory, even if it came later than Putin promised, developed first into a quagmire and then into a war that has empowered Ukraine and weakened Russia on the geopolitical stage. The Atlantic Council reports that Ukraine's military is now so impressive that its soldiers often perform better than their NATO colleagues during joint exercises. Ukraine is no longer the security burden that it was when Putin invaded. It's a contributor and a world leader in much of the technology that is purpose-built to defeat Russia. For Putin and his vision of a great Russia that mirrors the country of old, this is an outright catastrophe. A nation that was supposed to be little more than an addition to Russia has created the blueprint for stopping Russia in its tracks. Putin was meant to be the leader who launched Russia back into the stratosphere of geopolitical relevance, making it a bigger player than it's been for decades. But all he has really managed to achieve is the humiliation of a military that has been revealed as a paper tiger, and the collapse of Russian influence on a huge scale. And that takes us beyond Ukraine and into the wider ramifications of Putin's abject failure in the war that he started. Regions where Russia once held sway, backed by the seemingly indomitable might of its military, are now starting to turn away from Putin. We see this clearly in the South Caucasus. Once upon a time, Russia ruled this region. It did so for 150 years, and it still held an enormous amount of influence under Putin. Russia's leader was able to stoke the fires between nations like Armenia and Azerbaijan, promising protection and support to whichever suited Putin, all backed by the military that is now being torn apart in Ukraine. None of these tactics are working anymore. Relations between Russia and Azerbaijan collapsed after it was revealed that Russian police had tortured 2 Azerbaijani citizens to death during a crackdown in Yekaterinburg. That incident sparked arrests and accusations of Russian spying. Russia destroyed relations altogether in December 2024 when it shot down an Azerbaijani civilian plane, killing 38 in the process. But hey, at least Russia could still support Armenia as it engages in its own battles with Azerbaijan. Except that isn't really the case anymore. On June 8th, it was made official. Armenia's standing Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan had won his re-election bid, defeating candidates supported by Putin and overcoming a Russian pressure campaign that included threats of ending trade relations. At one point, Putin made it clear to Pashinyan that the gas that Russia supplies to Armenia, which is supplied at $177.50 per 1,000 cubic meters versus the European market prices of $600, would be under threat if Pashinyan continued to push for Armenia to join the European Union. None of it mattered. Azerbaijan has turned its back, and Armenia is continuing a march toward the west that has been slowly going on for years. There had been a massive recalibration in the Caucasus. It was only in 2020 that Russia played the role of peacekeeper to bring an end to the 44-day war between Armenia and Azerbaijan over who controls Nagorno-Karabakh. Now, around 6 years later, and after a disastrous Ukraine campaign, Putin has lost influence in both of these countries to the point where neither wants anything much to do with Russia. This is what we mean when we talk about Putin making Russia smaller. Every day that Putin continues the war in Ukraine, he moves Russia closer to geopolitical irrelevance. And there's so much more than the rise of Ukraine and the issues Russia has in the Caucasus to showcase that. But before digging deeper, this is The Military Show, and we make videos to show you how power really moves. If you haven't already, hit subscribe and then get back to the video. Russia's decline as a regional power may be most evident in the Caucasus, but we're seeing it all over Europe and Central Asia. The likes of Moldova, Georgia, and Kazakhstan have all received very clear reminders of just how dangerous it is to be situated close to Russia when a legacy-obsessed madman like Putin is on the loose, says Estonia's International Centre for Defence and Security. Moldova is actively pursuing European Union membership, like Ukraine and Armenia, which is yet another example of Putin's war leading countries that Russia could once influence deeper into the embrace of the West. Other nations, such as Tajikistan, have seen Russia pull out weapons and troops, so they could be used in Ukraine. That sort of message doesn't go ignored. Russia is supposed to be the powerhouse in this war. If it's pulling out the protection that it's promised to other nations, then what does that really say about the country and what Putin has turned it into? Angering nations like Tajikistan and Kazakhstan is also a problem for Putin, as both are members of the Eurasian Economic Union that helps Russia to circumvent sanctions. If nations leave that union, we again see Russia's power base declining. That's the exact opposite of what Putin envisioned when he launched his Ukraine invasion. If the dream of Greater Russia has been shattered by all of this, the pieces have been put together and turned into a nightmare when it comes to Russia on the global geopolitical scale. We mentioned protection a moment ago. Syria, Venezuela, and Iran were also supposed to benefit from Russian weapons, and the promise from Putin that Russia would work to protect their national interests. What do all three of these countries have in common? Their leaders have been killed or deposed since the Ukraine war began, and Russia didn't raise a finger to save any of them. Whether that was due to a lack of inclination or an inability to exert power, because it has none after years of brutal fighting, doesn't really matter. The message is still out there that Russia cannot protect those that it claims it will help. Russia's global prestige is at a low not seen since Putin took power, and that clearly makes Russia smaller. However, it's not just waning geopolitical influence that is Putin's problem here. In some ways, he's actively losing control of parts of Russia that he controlled long before he started his invasion. Russia's Far East, in particular, is turning into a problem. Russia's Far Eastern Federal District accounts for 40% of Russian territory. despite only being home to about 8 million people. This also happens to be a region over which one of Russia's supposed allies, China, believes it holds some claim. Now, we're not saying that China is going to invade Russia, even though there is now a clear power imbalance between the two nations that will also infuriate Putin. China is being cleverer than that. It's been growing its presence in Russia's Far East ever since Putin invaded. When European countries left Russia in protest at the invasion, China stepped up to the plate and replaced them. In doing so, it made Russia more reliant on China and opened the door for an influx of China's migrant workers into Russia's Far East. China now has special administrative regions and advanced special economic zones in Siberia, and the yuan has replaced the Russian ruble for all activities that Chinese companies conduct in Siberia. Again, this isn't likely to lead to some grand territorial annexation by China. But Beijing doesn't need to do anything like that. It's content to take advantage of Putin's growing desperation to exert its influence over Russia's Far East. Again, this is a result of Putin's failures in Ukraine. With his focus still on the 3-day special military operation that has lasted over 4 years, Putin can do nothing but allow China to do what it wants because he knows that Russia doesn't survive without China's support. After all, China buys around 50% of Russia's crude oil. If that money goes away, then everything that Putin strives for crumbles to dust. This is the sorry situation that Putin now finds himself in. His quest to restore Russia to the status that it held during the height of the Soviet Union has only ended up making Russia smaller, literally and geopolitically. When the Soviet Union was at its peak, Russia controlled 14 republics on top of its own territory. Compare that to what Putin has achieved since he launched his invasion of Ukraine. Ukraine itself, which was once the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, remains unconquered and is a stronger geopolitical force now than it has ever been. Nations in the Caucasus are turning their backs on Russia, making Russia smaller by virtue of lost influence. We're seeing similar tensions in Europe and Central Asia, and Putin can't even protect Russian turf in the Far East from encroaching Chinese influence that Russia has to allow if it's to stand any chance of turning things around in Ukraine. And there's one more way that the death of Putin's dream on Ukrainian soil has made Russia smaller. It's utterly ruining everything for Russia's people. There are so many examples of how the average Russian's life has gotten worse since the Ukraine war that there are too many to count. Russia is screwing around with pensions by creating a new system in which there will be no government co-financing. The Kremlin says it will make up for that by offering tax incentives to businesses to participate in this new scheme, which might work if Putin hadn't created an economic situation that led to 200,000 of Russia's small and medium-sized businesses going bust during the first 3 months of 2026 alone. There is even potential that Putin will cut pensions, all to keep on funding his failing war. Speaking of finding funding, Russia's public and social services have borne the brunt of Putin's desperate search for the cash that he needs. Examples of the chaos include the April announcement that Moscow is planning to cut over 105,000 workers from the public sector in 2026, which would follow on from a 2025 in which Russia laid off 32,000 workers from the same sector. Again, it's all to save money to pump into Ukraine, and it wouldn't be surprising to see many of those laid-off workers end up on the front lines in Ukraine out of desperation. Other examples include the June 24th revelation that Russia plans to cut its federal road maintenance budget by over $142 million in 2026, followed by a near $260 million cut the year after. This is the type of situation that Putin has created for his people. Every penny must be pinched to fund the failing Ukraine war, and it's the people who are paying the price. That's 2,000 kilometers of highways that were set to be built or modernized just gone, all thanks to Ukraine. Russia's people have watched their quality of life plummet in other ways too. The cost of living in the country has skyrocketed on the back of rampant inflation. United 24 Media reported on June 29th that the situation has gotten so bad that 81% of Russians are cutting back on their food budgets. Specifically, 34% are economizing when it comes to food, while 47% are actively cutting back their food purchases and costs to make up for the stagnating real incomes and grocery store prices growing higher. Again, Ukraine has done all of this to Russia. It's Ukraine creating a fuel crisis combined with a shortage of imported goods that is creating a supply and demand problem that is crippling Russia's people. Right now, Trading Economics reports that inflation in Russia stands at 5.3%. The country's base interest rate is 14.25%. Neither is a good figure, though they're both better percentages than we saw at the beginning of 2026. However, the inflation rate, at least, is not what it seems. Euronews reports that Swedish intelligence claims that Russia has been faking its economic data to hide the impact that Putin's war has had on the economy. Inflation isn't hovering around the 5% mark, Sweden says. It's closer to 15%. practically reaching parity with Russia's interest rate. Russians can't afford to buy what they used to buy, and they also can't afford the interest payments on loans that might have helped them out. This is what Putin has created. His desperate attempt to place himself into the pantheon of great Russian leaders has made Russia smaller, and now Putin has no other options. He's gambling on the capabilities of a Russian military that has already proven itself wholly incapable of defeating Ukraine. For Russia's leader, the only way to come out of the war he started is to somehow manage to capture the Donbas region by the end of the year. That's what he's betting on, a campaign that has so far seen Russia crashing up against the indomitable fortress belt, somehow resulting in a victory in the next 6 months. At least then, Putin could claim a win of sorts. One of Ukraine's most valuable regions would be under Russia's control, and he could negotiate from a position of power. Of course, the rest of Ukraine wouldn't have fallen, but at least Russia would have something. This gamble isn't going to pay off. And when it all falls apart, as Ukraine defends the Donbas into 2027 and beyond, whatever scant optimism that things might finally get better in Russia that exist will finally evaporate. Putin began his war to secure his legacy. He's done that all right, only he won't go down as a great leader who made Russia bigger and stronger. Putin will be written into history as a man who started a war against the nation that he couldn't finish. He'll be the man who bankrupted Russia, sent the quality of life of its people back by decades, lost both regional and global influence, and perhaps even gave up Russia's Far East, all for the chance to take Ukraine. Putin's dream is dead, and it won't be until his body follows suit that Russia has any sort of chance of recovery. Oh, and there's also the very real possibility that Russia is going to actively lose territory in Ukraine that it has held since 2014. Occupied Crimea is in trouble. Once Putin's prized conquest, Crimea is being gradually isolated by Ukraine and transformed into a symbol of all of Putin's failures. The campaign is brilliant, the implications are massive, and you can find out all about it by watching our video. Before you go, also make sure that you subscribe to The Military Show so you catch more of our analysis of Putin, the failed leader. And thank you for watching.